Saw this clip today from Wes Huff, posted by the Gospel Coalition, where he talks about what he euphemistically calls three common mistakes to avoid in apologetics. One of those common quote unquote mistakes, I will refer to it as, is deceptively misrepresenting the evidence supporting the New Testament. So, deceptive behavior, I'm going to call it. And while he doesn't name drop Josh McDowell in particular, this is something that's been associated with Josh McDowell for years. So we're going to talk about that after on the other side of the clip. But first, let's start with the clip and hear from Wes Huff how apologists misrepresent the manuscript evidence in a way to support the perceived veracity, historical trustworthiness of the New Testament.
We need to be careful not to over exaggerate in certain claims apologetically. My area of speciality is in manuscripts, and there has been some exaggerations in sort of the apologetic endeavors to answer certain questions about manuscripts, where the, say, manuscripts of the New Testament are compared to the writings of other ancient texts like Homer and Pliny and Plutarch, and it's talked about that the copies of the manuscripts of the New Testament dwarf all of these others, and that's actually true. But when I started to dig into some of the catalogs of those manuscripts, what I found was that classics categorize manuscripts very differently than New Testament studies does, and that classics tends to catalog what they call functional manuscripts, where you can actually read from the document, whereas New Testament studies counts every fragment that has a discernible text that could be linked to a New Testament document as a manuscript. And so this tends to start to compare apples to orchards, in that it is true that we do have far more New Testament copies of ancient manuscripts than we do, say, for Homer. But in sort of presenting that data, sometimes it can present something where we're not really making an accurate comparison, and the ends to the means actually end up skewing the data in a way that, if you actually look into the data, is somewhat unhelpful.
Okay, so that's the gist of the critique. I really, first of all, appreciate it when an apologist like Wes Huff is going to call out bad behavior on the part of other apologists, because this is actually an endemic problem within the evangelical industrial apologetic subculture. A couple of things I would want to say at the outset, however. First of all, uh, just talking about it as a mistake or an exaggeration, I think is, again, euphemistic language. It's really deceptive behavior. And I'm going to make that clearer in just a moment with a specific example from Josh McDowell. And that leads me to a second point: name drop. Let people know who is doing this. There should be some public shaming when apologists like McDowell, for years, decades, have misled people about aspects of the historical veracity of the New Testament and generally the evidence supporting Christianity. The same thing often is targeted at Lee Strobel and his book, The Case for Christ, because of the way it is really misleading and I would say deceptive in the way that it shows the evidence, suggesting that all the evidence supports the historicity of Jesus and the claims about the church. And there's like no substantive evidence among historians and theologians and philosophers that would go against that, which is, again, of course, that's deeply misrepresenting the actual nature of the evidence. You don't make Christianity, you don't increase the, let me put it this way, you don't show your love, your commitment to the truth of Christianity through deception. That is just absolutely contrary. It's like thinking you can love somebody by hitting them, right? That's not what you do. It's a contradiction of what you profess to be about. Okay, I want to take a look now at McDowell's stuff. Just give you an example of what we're talking about. Okay, so this is from josh.org. So Josh McDowell's website. Here he's got this article, Can We Really Know If the Bible is God's Word? Now, this features a guest blogger article, but by a fellow named Craig Owens. But note first, the article is featured on Josh McDowell's website. And the second thing to note is that Craig Owens depends on Josh McDowell's own published work to make his case. So he talks here on this point one about what he calls the biographical test, determining whether the text of the historical record has been transmitted accurately. Then I'm going to skip to right here. Regarding the New Testament, Josh McDowell says, quote, I believe there is more evidence for the reliability of the New Testament than for any other 10 pieces of classical literature put together. And then he drives the point home with this chart. So Owens then writes, check out this chart reproduced from McDowell's book, God Breathed, to see by comparison to other literature how close in dating the earliest biblical manuscripts are and how many of those manuscripts have been discovered. Okay, this is the same chart that that was just cited on that website, but of course it's a lot larger here. So note what it says here is you have the author of the text and you have the text, and then you have the manuscript evidence and so on, the time gap in years between when the text was written to the earliest extant manuscript of the text. The other texts that he has here are like Iliad, Herodotus's histories, Gallic Wars, etc. So those are all unified literary works. Each one of them is a unified text that was written over, a relatively concentrated span of time by an individual. When it comes to the New Testament, McDowell includes the New Testament in this chart as a text, a unified text, which of course it isn't. It's a collection, it's a library of texts from the first century and possibly from the early second century, and from multiple authors, of course. The second thing to note, however, um, so then he talks about, okay, what is the time gap between when the text was written? Hold on, my dog's scratching. So when was the text written? And then what is the earliest extant manuscript of the text? And right there we have, he says when if you come to the New Testament, the time gap was 50 to 100 years. And the manuscript, the earliest manuscript of the New Testament is right here. It is AD 130. He puts it at, which is again a time gap of 50 years. So an average reader is going to see this and they're going to think, okay, the earliest extant copy of the New Testament is one, AD 130, which is 50 years maybe after the New Testament was written. And that's equivalent to Herodotus' history or Homer's Iliad as unified literary works. But in fact, McDowell's not referencing there the New Testament. He's actually referencing the Gospel of John, which is in the New Testament, but he doesn't tell you that here. So that right there is deeply misleading and deeply deceptive. He leads you to think we have a copy of the New Testament from AD 130, but in fact, it's the Gospel of John. But then the second deception then piles onto that. And this brings us back to Wes Huff, talking about the different ways that biblical scholars and classic scholars use the word manuscript. So when the New Testament historians are talking about manuscript, they could be talking about a small fragment of a piece of papyrus. And that is what we have, for example. So this is one of the two sides of P152, which is from the Gospel of John. I think it's chapter 19 or 20, if memory serves, in there. So you can see the Greek written on there, but it's just about the size of a postage stamp. That, and of course, some scholars will debate whether that should be dated 130. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that that's a fair dating. But in fact, then what you do is you have two bait and switches. The first bait and switch is to make the reader think it's the New Testament that dates to 130. The second thing is, even if you're thinking, oh, it's the Gospel of John, it's to think it's the manuscript of the Gospel of John rather than a postage stamp sized fragment of the manuscript of the Gospel of John that dates to 130. The thing that I would want to say about this is, again, this is not a mistake. And this is not just an exaggeration. While I appreciate what Wes Huff says here, I think he undercuts the strength of his own critique by using this overly charitable, euphemistic language for what is a pattern of deceptive behavior to lead Christians to think that the evidence, the historical evidence for the New Testament, is much greater than it is. And the tragedy, as I think one of the tragedies, as I think Wes Huff kind of alludes to, is the fact that okay, the evidence is good for the New Testament when compared to other ancient texts. So by grossly overstating the strength of it, you just poison the well for people to be willing to consider any of the evidence. They just throw all of it out because you were deceptive. And that is what's so frustrating. And that is why I think it is important to call out people like Josh McDowell by name. And there are many others who have repeated based on Josh McDowell. And I don't know who first came up with this, if it was McDowell or whether it's been traded around. But I remember Del Tackett in his Truth Project does the same thing, which was a hugely popular fundamentalist curriculum produced by Focus on the Family. And many other Christian apologists I've seen do the same thing. It's deeply deceptive and it only serves to discredit Christianity. So kudos at least to Wes Huff for calling it out, even if not quite by name.